Can you believe that Charles Darwin received a degree in divinity? He, among others, spurred the idea of evolution. Luckily for science, Darwin hopped on the HMS Beagle at the request of a friend to find biblical representation of creation. On his journey, he collected many specimens and began to admire earthly processes. It wasn't until 5 years later, when he returned home, that he began to wonder about competition of resources between animals. Five more years went by until Darwin finally started writing out his theory of evolution. Then he did something crazy. He locked away his work for 10 years. You might be wondering why on earth you would hide your life's work. But you have to remember that during Darwin's time, the church had answers for everything. Darwin had to be very careful about what he published so as not to be persecuted. So what he did in the meantime was have lots and lots of babies. A ton. 10 to be exact. After all this time had passed, an old correspondent sent Darwin a message explaining his idea of evolution. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace, and he too had come up with a similar theory on the evolution of species. Darwin was now forced into a tough spot. He either had to give up all credit, or publish his work, steal the credit, and risk persecution. A compromise was reached, and a summary of their two papers was presented to the Linnaean Society. Once Darwin published, however, the public was clamoring for his work. However, the critics were less than happy. The reason the critics were so unhappy was that this new theory was short on evidence and did not coincide with their ideas. They thought the world was simply too young for all this change. Scientists world round were busy poking holes in Darwin's theory. An engineer named Fleming Jenkins noted that if the new traits arose, they would quickly be diluted in a few generations. Luckily, a trained physicist turned monk by the name of Gregor Mendel was very interested in peas. He spent years scientifically performing carefully controlled experiments on the peas, breeding tens of thousands of different plants. Through painstaking work and careful observation, Mendel came to the conclusion that each of these plants had two different factors, which he coined dominant and recessive, that controlled traits in plants. We now call these traits genes, although that term wasn't coined until 1913. Mendel was so diligent and precise that his experiments took 8 years, as he verified it over and over again with other species of plants. Mendel and Darwin lived in the same era and even studied each other's work, but both failed to correspond with the other, keeping Mendel's striking evidence from supporting Darwin's theory. The topic remained relatively obscure till later on, when one of Darwin's supporters, T.H. Huxley, brought the topic to light, at which point the brief note on the similarity of man and ape caused quite the stir. This was all topped off when Darwin presented his newest book, On the Descent of Man, which supported this connection, but had little evidence at the time. All of their work nearly fell to the wayside, until it was combined in the 1930s into a unified theory called, conveniently, modern synthesis. The combination of Mendel's research with Darwin's theory finally gave evolution the boost it needed to be considered an accepted scientific theory. Who decides what counts as good science or worthwhile science? Based on what? Does scientific discovery happen overnight? What are some questions or controversies that seem to surround the ideas of learning, understanding, and participating in science? What opinions do you have about these questions and controversies? How is science cultural, historical, or political? How do things like race, gender, and religion fit into your diagrams about science and about science learning?